Okay, so we will get going. Can everyone hear all right? So I want to really thank Rav Yoni Rosensweig for joining us this morning. For people who don't know, Rav Yoni Rosensweig, I'll read the formal bio, is a community rabbi of the Netzach Menashe community in Beit Shemesh and the author of several books. Teaches Halacha, Gemara and Machshava, Midreshet Lindenbaum. Between 2006 and 2009, he served as Rosh Kollel of the Mizrachi community in Melbourne, Australia. Upon his return, he headed Yeshivat Hamivtar, which many of us were very fond, for 3 years, and became Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Shevut, Yisrael, and Efrat, a post which he held until 2016. He has Semicha from Rav Nachum Eliezer Rabinovitch, of blessed memory, and from the chief rabbinate, a Bachelors of Education and a Bachelors in Philosophy and History. That's the formal bio. But informally, I will say that Rav Yoni is a leader and a scholar, someone that grapples with, deals with, teaches, educates about the full breadth of our tradition in ways that many across broad spectrums find inspiring, and is also a passionate advocate, but not just an advocate and an activist, like the most educated and thoughtful about a number of issues, from the Aguna issue to the one we're here to discuss this morning, mental health and Halacha. There's a forthcoming book, which I think will be one of the most major and important contributions to kind of the canon of Halacha, maybe in modern history. I hope that's not an understatement. These are matters of life and death, and Rav Yoni's been posting about them and educating all of us about them and serving as an advisor and kind of the go-to authority in the rabbinic community on issues of mental health and Halacha for a long time. But it's really just a pleasure to bring him here this morning. I dare say he's one of the bright rabbinic lights in the land of Israel. And this issue couldn't be more important. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And the hashtag for this event was Break the Stigma. In our community, as in many others, there is a stigma, but there are also many issues with Halacha, Judaism, and mental health that don't get discussed because of that stigma. And so my hope this morning is in bringing them to light. The conversations that are happening in almost every household can happen in the light of day with clarity, thoughtfulness, see what the tradition has to say, and to really deal with them in an intentional manner. So I hope that is a fair way of framing what we're going to do. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rabbi Yoni Rosensweig.
Sorry, 1 second. There we go. My camera turned off for some reason. Okay. First of all, thank you for that glowing introduction. I'm not sure I can live up to all those accolades, but I really do appreciate it. Thank you. And thank you for having me here in a Zoom conversation with your congregation. I really appreciate it, and I hope that we can learn a little something today, B'ezrat Hashem, about these topics, specifically about mental health, and see how we kind of like keep the conversation moving about those things. I guess what I'll do is I'll speak for about say 35-40 minutes, and then I'll open it up for questions and comments, which I find people usually have after I speak. So I definitely want to give time for that, because I assume we have is about an hour. That's what I'm assuming. Yeah, I think the most important thing was the thing that Rav Barry already said, which was that it's important that we have these conversations. It's important that we talk about them also at home, that we open them up to the community at large, because whether or not we are having the conversation, these things are happening. And that's kind of the first and one of the most important takeaway that we need to have, is to realize that things are occurring, whether or not we're aware of it. They're occurring around us. And if we're not part of the conversation, then we're missing the conversation in a very significant way, in a way that affects lives, like very, very significantly and seriously. So that's very important for me to say. But now that I've said that, let me go back to the beginning a little bit and explain how I got into this, and the book that I've been writing, etc. And I'm not doing this as a promo for the book. I promise you that all this is connected to the topic of our conversation today. So it was 4 years ago. 4 years ago, I was ignorant in the area of mental health completely. And of course, I heard like everybody else heard, about this and that and the other. And, I think if you asked just like a, layperson, what they know, usually, it's usually about OCD, ADHD, a little bit of, they've heard of depression, they heard of dementia, et cetera, et cetera. But you'll notice a lot of times that they've heard of it, but they haven't heard of it in the way that they've heard of physical ailments. Like if someone mentions cancer, for example, usually we can all know, I'm not a medical professional in any way, shape, or form, right? But chemotherapy and like I know how to throw these words around. I understand what goes on. Yeah, I get what more or less the course of the treatment is going to be, what kind of hardships they're going to have. Going to be a few of these, a few of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that. There's stage 1 and there's stage 2 and stage 3. Like we know how to throw these terms around. We know how to more or less relate to what's going on, even though we don't really know. We're not professionals in any way, but we understand the lingo. When someone says depression, we don't understand. We don't understand what depression means. We talk about it as if we do, but we don't really understand. And we certainly don't understand what the course of the treatment is supposed to be. Meaning, okay, so someone is suffering from depression. What should we do for him? What should be done for him? What is the doctor doing for him? Is he prescribing something? Why is he prescribing something? How are the pills going to help? We don't really get it. Like we don't really understand. And depression is like relatively well known, but I'm talking about the other stuff. For example, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Or dementia or things like that. Once again, I think a lot of us have heard the words or heard the terms. I think that we have very little understanding of what goes into that, what happens to the person, and what the course of treatment is going to look like, whether it's chronic or not chronic, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We don't understand, and that's, I'm only giving that as an example so you get what I'm saying when I say that I was ignorant 4 years ago. I was like pretty ignorant, in the sense that I knew some terms, but I never really understood. And when did this become apparent to me? It became apparent to me when I started getting shilas, started getting questions on mental health and halacha. And I looked around, because that's what rabbis many times do when they don't know the answer. They Google it, they ask friends, they ask their Rabbi a little bit, et cetera, et cetera. And what I found out is there are no answers. It does not mean, I don't mean to say, to be clear, that no rabbi or no rabbinate has ever given an answer, about a mental health, related question. And I'm not saying that. I'm not saying, I'm the first one, to ever give answers about that. It's not true. It's patently incorrect, and it's not true. I'm not even talking about, in the old days, in the times of the Gemara, which of course, already we have certain discussions, and in the Rishonim, etc. But even today, in the modern age, right? Are there modern rabbanim who answer? Sure, of course. But will you find those answers online? Will you find those answers in books? Rarely so. Rarely so. And that's what's, on the one hand, surprising, and on the other hand, sad, is that you will rarely find these questions. And I invite you to Google any other question. Like I invite you to Google kashrut questions or Shabbos questions. You'll many times find Ask the Rabbi, and you'll find them online, and you'll find some sort of discussion about those things. Now Google mental health questions, and I once again, I believe that you'll find that you just won't find. That's the problem. Now, in my research, I can tell you that I did find some articles, some discussions, but that's not a lot. And if I tell you that I found, let's say 150 or so instances where mental health was discussed, that may sound like a lot to you. It's very little. If you think about halachic literature, and those who are versed in halachic literature know what I'm talking about, that's very little, to have around. And most of those discussions, by the way, were about extreme cases. We're not about some of the more classic cases and that we deal with today, is some of the more gray stuff, which I will talk about soon. So also, whatever there is out there was very, very little. So I went to a friend of mine, Dr. Shmuel Harris, a psychiatrist here in Israel, a friend of mine from a few years back, and I asked him whether we could learn together. We were anyway learning a chavrusa together. We just decided, I decided we could learn this topic together. He would bring his mental health knowledge, and I would bring my halachic knowledge, and we'd learn it together because there was no way that I would understand any of this without someone who understood something about mental health. And so we started learning an hour a week together, and we did that for about 3.5 years. And I learned a lot during that time. And what I started off as a project that was meant to help me answer a few shilas, a few questions in my community, it became a real understanding that there's need for a book. There's need for a proper, codex, so to speak, on this issue to be written so that people could reference, could look it up, could see it, and that's how the book came about. Now, a lot of times when I say halacha and mental health, so people they say, you're right, but we don't even know what we're talking about. Yeah, like when you say halacha and mental health, what questions are there within halacha and mental health? Meaning, what kind of questions would one get, right? So let me give you one of the most common questions that I get. One of the most common questions that I get is, can someone suffering from depression listen to music on Shabbat? That's a very common question. Almost all the people that I've spoken to who suffer from depression or anxiety have wondered this at one point or another, because music is a coping mechanism. And I will talk about that maybe a little bit later if I have the time. You won't find any written discussion of this. It's fascinating. It's such a common question. Once I started answering these questions, I realized how common it is. And if you will not find any written discussion that I'm aware of, or maybe there is one, but I'm not aware of one, about this topic. And it's so very important. It, of course, it requires that you understand two major things. Number one, what is the halachic status of using electricity on Shabbat? And that's one question, the halachic question. And number two, to understand what someone suffering from depression or anxiety means. They're suffering. Suffering how? What's happening to them? How bad is it? How do we evaluate how bad it is from a halachic perspective? Right? All these things need answers in order to be able to give the proper response to the person who needs that. Now, when I spoke to rabbis about it, and I spoke to many rabbis about it, I don't mean to name drop. That's not the point. The reason that I went to speak to a lot of rabbanim, I'll just say this as in parentheses. The reason I went to speak to a lot of rabbanim was for one very, very simple reason. I assume, I can't know for sure, but I assume that with all due respect to the wonderful things that Rabbi Barry said about me, I'm guessing a lot of you haven't heard my name until this moment. So, I didn't want there to be a book that would be pointless. In other words, if I wrote a book, people would say, okay, Yoni Rosensweig allows, who is Yoni Rosensweig? Yeah. But if on a topic that is groundbreaking and that is new, and that in a sense, the first book of its kind was written, I wanted you to hear from Rav Mordechai Willig and Rav Hershel Schachter and Rav Asher Weiss and Rav Yitzhak Zilberstein and Rav Yuval Sherlow and Rav Ram HaKohen and Rav Baruch Gigi and Rav Nachum Eliezer Rabinovitch and Rav Eliezer Melamed, the author of Pinei Halacha, and Rav Yaakov Ariel and Rav Dov Lior, etc., etc. I can keep on with the name dropping if you like, but the point is not to cover myself in stardust. The point is to say that I know with most people that I spoke to, right, one of those names was unacceptable. People were always like, that's the person you asked? He's crazy, yeah? And then you mentioned someone else. That guy, he doesn't understand anything about mental health, etc., etc. But the way I did it, believe me, there's one name in there you respect, at least one. There's at least one name for sure. So I tried to get people from the Haredi community all the way to the liberal community, as much as I could, in order to make sure that there's always a name in there that you respect, and there's always a person that you could turn to. Now, the reason I mentioned this in parentheses was to say that when I spoke to these rabbanim, a lot of the time, the problem was getting them not to understand the importance of mental health, because that they understood, but they were very worried about the definitions. In other words, how do I know that this person is really unwell? Someone has a fever, I get it, right? I get it. They have a fever, right? They're sick, right? But if you haven't been in a situation where you've suffered depression, for example, right? I mean, you can't see depression on an MRI, right? That's the problem. You can't see it and you can't identify it and you don't know what it is exactly. So, depressed. I mean, what does that even really mean? He got up on the wrong side of the bed. Is that what happened? The guy got up in the morning. He was feeling like, I don't want to go to work today. We've all had that. But because then I'm going to be Machal Shabbos, that's the problem. The problem is that we don't properly understand always what mental health means or what poor mental health means and what all these conditions imply or suggest. So many of the Rabbanim, right, who I spoke to, needed to be kind of like, you needed to explain the situation. You needed to explain what the functional consequences of each situation was in order to help them to understand what can or cannot be said or should be said, about different scenarios, right? So that was the challenge. Okay, so what am I trying to say by that? I'm trying to say by that is that if you really understand what's going on, if you really understand how much people are suffering with mental health, there's no doubt that the rabbis would paskin and paskin leniently on many of the issues, as I have seen with my own eyes and spoken to with them, about these issues. Once they understand, once they get it, then it's not a problem. Let me give you an example. I spoke to a woman, a mother of, I don't remember how many kids she has, 3, 4. And she was suffering from a few things: eating disorder, depression, anxieties, a few other things, maybe some OCD, I don't remember exactly. And she called me up. 2 years ago or so, I made my interest in Halacha and mental health known, and ever since then, I've been getting, like a steady stream of questions. It grows all the time. I always say that ever since 2 years ago, I've been a rabbi for about 15 years. Ever since 2 years ago, I would say that in 1 week, I get more questions than I've gotten in 13 years of the rabbinate. Every week, I get more questions in that 1 week than in the 13 years prior to that time, because people are suffering. They just never knew that they could necessarily turn to anybody. So that's the problem. But she called me up. She heard about me, and she said to me that she's suffering from depression and she doesn't know what to do. She said that she has certain coping mechanisms during the week, and those coping mechanisms include taking a hot shower and listening to music. But she couldn't do those things on Shabbat, so she wanted to know what she could do. So I said to her, how long have you been suffering from this? So she said, a while. I remember it was several months, several years. It was a while. I asked her, I said, okay, what have you been doing until now? Meaning you're only calling me now, so what have you been doing until now? And her answer is something that we should all remember. She said, until now, what I've been doing is I've been either inducing vomiting to deal with it, or I've been cutting myself. And she didn't mean in a suicidal way. She meant in a non-suicidal fashion, but she was cutting herself to relieve tension. Here's the, I can tell you what I answered her, but I told her she should definitely take the shower and listen to the music, but that's not the point. My point is this: if we don't give answers to people, they will cope some other way. It's not that they're not coping; they're coping. They're using coping mechanisms to cope, but they're going to do something. In other words, it's not like you can, as a posek, decide I'm not answering this shayla, because that's a posek sometimes want to do. They want to say, look, I'm not so sure. It's a gray area. Like, how do you define mental health? Okay, you know what? I hear it. You don't know how to define mental health. You have a problem with this thing. Well, I really think that despite that problem, despite that trouble that you're having, you need to find a way to define the issue and to paskin. Because if you're not, then the people are paskening for themselves. And what they're paskening is usually not good. Either it's not good halachically, or it's not good from a mental health perspective. Either they are being more lenient than they should, and then they're beating themselves up for it, and they're feeling bad religiously, and they feel to blame, and they feel like God hates them, etc., etc., etc. Or even if they're doing the right thing, but they didn't get a psak about it from a rabbi, then they're still feeling bad, and to blame. And I get so many calls and messages from people who feel like, they're letting themselves down, letting God down, etc. And they're living with that shame. Or, and this I think is actually the worst option, is that they're not doing the right thing halachically, meaning that they decided to be machmer, to be more stringent upon themselves at the expense of their mental health. That woman who was inducing vomiting or cutting, that's terrible. Why should she do those things if she can listen to music or take a hot shower? And I can see that someone wrote here in the comments, should she absolutely listen to music? Like in her case, right? She had clear and ample evidence during the week that helped her, meaning that helped her with her anxiety and her depression. Now we can go into the halachic side of it, meaning what is electricity? Is it a deraita? Is it a derabanan, rabbinic or Torah prohibition, which is a valid discussion. Personally, I believe it to be rabbinic in that situation, which makes it easier to allow. So we can definitely look at that and decide. But also, it would depend on the specific case, right? I'm not sure how many therapists there are on the call, how many professionals, but I can tell you from my experience that whenever I've asked a professional, and thank you, Rabbi Dolger. So I should be extra careful. But whenever I've asked a therapist a question relating to my book, and I've definitely done that many times, the initial answer that I received was always the same. We don't have to write a book. I just take out a pamphlet, because the answer was always, every case is different. So I should just write those 4 words on a piece of paper and send them out. That would be my book. Every case is different. So 100%, every case is different. And I know every case is different, and you can't pass him for everybody in one shot. And I'm definitely aware of that. It, by the way, created a real challenge for me in writing the book, because I had to create, in a sense, a language that didn't so much describe things in black and white as describe them in gray. So, in other words, instead of talking about concepts, in other words, if I say, can someone with depression listen to music on Shabbat? I don't think there's any therapist worth his or her salt that would tell me that they can answer that question. They would say to me, I need to know a history, I need to know what they're suffering, I need to know if there's suicidal ideation, I need to know what's going on with the person, etc., etc., etc. They need details, they need facts, yeah? You can't just answer, depression is a buzzword. It doesn't really encapsulate the experience or the person fully. And therefore, you can't, in the same way that OCD doesn't, and that agoraphobia doesn't, and that PTSD doesn't, right? So all these things, or borderline personality disorder, or all these things, right? You cannot really, generally, you cannot really paskin just like based on the words, based on the names, the terms for these disorders. You really need to know a little bit of a history and a little bit of an understanding of what's going on with a person. So I learned that early on. I learned early on how to ask questions to therapists in order to get an answer from them that can help me, rather than an answer that can't help me. So therefore, all I'm saying is the question that in the chat, which was, should that person definitely listen to music? In my evaluation, in that specific case, yes, absolutely. That was a much better option, and also justified halachically, considering the history and the specific case that was presented to me. But obviously, these things might change from place to place and person to person, depending on their needs, depending on how severe the depression is, depending on what else is going on. It's also important to know, and once again, the therapists here, apparently there are many of, will obviously tell you this as well, is that many times there's comorbidity, meaning that's a word that basically means that there's more than one thing going on. Meaning it's definitely, usually, right, you don't find a person with just one thing, just depression or just, I mean, it happens. I'm not saying that it can't happen. But many times they have more than one thing. And sometimes one thing gives birth to another, and it's a little bit of a cycle. I'm looking for a different word. Anyway, it's a chain of events that one leads to another, many times. That is unfortunate, of course, but it's also important to do that. So cases are composite, that's my point. Actual cases, real cases, right, are composite, they're complex. They're not just something that you can clearly define in one term or another. But the book that I wrote does try to take into account that complexity in the way that it describes things and in the footnotes, of course, that it provides. So all that is very, very complex and very complicated, and it did take me years to write. And of course, I did it all together with a psychiatrist and peer-reviewed both by rabbis and psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, dietitians, etc. I did my best. I'm sure that as you know, the first of anything, there are always going to be mistakes. So there's no doubt there are mistakes in the book. I'm already awaiting the criticism of the both the rabbinic and the professional world. But you know, as a first step, you know, I think that it's a legitimate step to take, and you know, we'll learn as we go, God willing. But the point of that whole story was to say that people need help. They really do. They need assistance, and they need real guidance. Because if we're not guiding them, then they have to deal with it on their own, and they will be guiding themselves, and in a way that is sometimes harmful and detrimental to them, from both a spiritual perspective and from a mental health perspective. So we really need to. I felt, and I feel all the more now, that we really need to get on board with a lot of those things. And you'll get all kinds of questions when you finally get into that world, right? As a rabbi, you'll suddenly find you get questions you wouldn't even believe, right? And some of them are halachic, some of them are spiritual in nature, and not even necessarily halachic. Maybe I'll give you two of the more interesting examples just to explain. Like once again, I'm trying as much as I can also just give you an idea of what I'm talking about. So I'll give you maybe some interesting examples. I had two questions that came to me about trichotillomania. I don't know if you know what that is. It's a fancy word for hair pulling disorder. What it basically means is people who, exactly what it sounds like, they pull out their hair, okay, obsessively, and it's like a it's like a tick they have, and it's you might say, okay, they pull out their hair, like it's not good, but what's the big deal? So big deal, yeah. So for example, there was a woman, a young woman in her 20s. She sent me pictures to my email of her head, and she had bald spots like all over her head, and from how much she pulled her hair, and she couldn't go outside. She was too embarrassed, right? She couldn't go outside. She couldn't go to studies. She couldn't go to work. She couldn't be with friends. You know, if she went outside, she had to wear a hat, which she didn't want to do most of the time, right? So in other words, something as simple as like pulling your hair, you might say, okay, it doesn't sound so bad, right? It could ruin your life. Like that could literally ruin your life, you know, that you have that disorder. And in her case, you know, she wanted to do certain things on Shabbat that would help deal with her trichotillomania. Things that were also like embroidery and knitting and sewing and, you know, things like that. That's what she wanted to do in order to help with her situation, right? That was a tough question. You know, it wasn't not so simple to allow that. But that's an example. Another guy with trichotillomania also used to pull the hairs on his beard, and also same idea. You know, was got really bad. You know, could get really bad, really embarrassing even for the guy. And he found that what helped him was to chew gum. Chewing gum was helpful to him as an action, as an activity that would stop him from pulling out the hair. So he wanted to know if he could chew gum on the fast day. Right, that was his question. Right, so what's interesting is not just the questions themselves, but also that they come out of left field. In other words, I would assume that if I would have asked, I think Barry's the rabbi here, so I'm gonna, say, if I asked for Barry before the shir, right? Like, what kind of questions do you think it would be with trichotillomania? I assume that he would say the gum thing was not going to be one of the things that he would say. Right? I assume he would think of other things. You don't even know, this is the point, you don't even know the kind of connections that are going to happen between a disorder and the thing that the person needs in order to help them deal with the disorder. Some of these connections are like very out of left field, right? It's an American crowd, so I can use baseball, term. It's like really, you can't even imagine like where it's going to come from, So So therefore, it's important to realize those things. I also had interesting interactions with certain women with DID. DID is dissociative identity disorder. It's basically what people call colloquially multiple personality. If I'm not mistaken, in the DSM-4, the previous version of like what they call the Bible of the psychiatrists, it was called multiple personality disorder, if I'm not mistaken. But the point is that I had a woman reach out to me. Like she reached out to me about certain questions that she had, and then I got a message from her other personality. In other words, I got a different message from the other, and she wasn't even aware that her other personality was reaching out to me. And then I answered the other one, and then a few weeks later, she suddenly realized that the other one had sent a message. So then she said, "Oh, thank you for answering. What's her name?" It was crazy. I can't even I don't think rabbis could even imagine getting questions like this. It doesn't even compute that you would have such a situation. I had a heartbreaking question with DID, where there was a student of mine who she also had a dissociative identity, and she dissociated. And it was very sad. She would wake up in the morning sometimes, and she wouldn't remember what she did the previous night. And when she looked at her phone, she would find pictures of what she did the previous night, and there was things that were against Halacha, and against her what she believes in, it was so hard for her. She felt so guilty, and she felt like, how could I do those things, and how could that be me? And it was horrible. It was really, and that's just pastoral care, right? That's not even halachic. It's just really being there for people, and telling them you're a good person. You're you're an Orthodox, religious Jew. Don't worry about it. And of course they'll still worry and they'll still feel bad because their body went and did those things, but they had no control over it. But all this is to explain to you how much there is for us to do. Meaning there's so much support that we need to give these individuals. And the problem is that they have almost no one to turn to. They hide it, right? It's the stigma that Rabbi was talking about at the beginning. They hide it from family. They hide it from friends. They hide it. I know there's a woman in Australia. Her husband, of course, knows. There's a very good friend that knows. And there's me. That's it. And she's been hospitalized. She's been actually hospitalized. So in other words, how she keeps it from everybody else, I don't know. But somehow, she goes to great lengths to keep it from everybody around her. And it's unbelievable, that she does that. But it shows how much shame and how much embarrassment there is that goes along with this. And it prevents people from being able to access the support that they need, which it makes me very, very sad. I think, we all know the Jewish community. We all know how much power and strength there is within the Jewish community. Meaning how many tzedakah, and there's chesed, and there's this, and there's that, and how much help there is when anybody needs the help, right? We're all there. We make food for people, and we help them in avelus and marriage and all these. And then there are all these people that are suffering, really alone. Our communities, we're really good at some things, and I wish that we could harness that goodness, right, in other things, right? So, for example, we're very good with the family unit, right? We're great with the family unit, we really are. But when it comes to single mothers, right, single parents, we're not as good a lot of times to fit them in. Sometimes we are, sometimes we're not. It depends on the community, right? Or older people who are just single, right? In their 30s, they haven't gotten married yet. Where do they fit into the community? How do we make them feel welcome and comfortable, right? So we have a lot of issues that we still need to work out. Like I said, the Jewish Orthodox community certainly is incredibly strong. It has an amazing power to it when used right. And when not used, it could ostracize you and make you feel so alone and so lonely because everyone else is getting attention and you're not. And of course you could say, well, what do you want from us? The people with mental health don't even tell us that they're unwell. That's true. That's true. I'm not saying there's anyone to blame. We should find ways to open our arms to people, and to make them feel welcome. But you're right, it's a long process that not just the Jewish community is going through, the entire world. has to find ways to make people feel more able to come out and say that they need help, say that they're unwell, that they need that support. They need that community. There was a father here in my community whose daughter was suffering from anorexia, and when he went to visit her in the ward where she was hospitalized, he said to me afterwards, he said, "Suddenly I saw everyone from the community. Suddenly I saw this guy and that guy and that." He didn't tell me names, but he said to me, "I saw this guy and that guy and her and him, etc., etc." In other words, suddenly you realize how many people are there. Suddenly you realize how many people are unwell. Suddenly you realize that in your community, if you think you know how many people are, you don't know. You think you know, but you don't really know. And that's the problem, is that we simply are completely unaware, whether by our fault, not by our fault, but we're unaware of how much suffering there is around us. So I hope that clarifies on, like how some of those questions, that I get. And I can, once again, I can give you some more, those questions just to drive some of these points home, right? But certainly dementia, right, which is also, very, very important issue and topic within our communities. In the research, they talk about something called brain reserve or cognitive reserve. The idea being that, the brain has a certain, let's call it strength or bearing, right? And it's able to stand strong against its own deterioration in certain contexts and less so in other contexts. So what the research shows generally is that if a person with dementia is able to stay within their own community, then the deterioration, if they're able to keep their routine, their deterioration will be minimized. Meaning, doesn't mean that it won't deteriorate, it'll go slower. While if a person is hospitalized, right, put in the ward outside of their family, friends, outside of their community, the deterioration of their dementia will probably be quicker. So obviously we have a vested interest in keeping people within the community in that situation. But that means we have to sacrifice, right? That means we have to step up in those situations and be willing to, in a sense, bear the brunt of what that means. And many times the question is, are we willing to? And let me explain something about that, because I want to be clear, right? The difference between mental health and physical health is many times also in how much the visitor needs to sacrifice, right? Because if someone, and I'm not belittling this, if someone is chas v'shalom suffering from cancer and dying, right, you can go up to them and you can sit by their bedside and you can probably have like a decent conversation, with them, where you say things and they say things and you have a proper back and forth, and maybe even say nice things, like you can say how much they mean to you and they could say how much you mean to them, and there could be a whole back and forth and a sense of closure. When someone is suffering from dementia, unfortunately my mother-in-law passed away about 5-6 months ago, and at the end she was suffering from dementia. When someone is suffering from dementia, they're not having conversations with you. They're shouting at you things that you don't even understand half the time why they're shouting them, right? Or what they mean. And they're probably scared and unable to say what they really think, even though they can understand what you're saying. So that's not a comfortable conversation. It's not a calm and nice, and doesn't give you any sense of closure. It makes you feel bad for the person, and they feel bad for you, and they feel bad for themselves. You can't really communicate properly with those individuals. Now imagine bringing an individual like that to shul, where sometimes they're shouting out or acting out, in all kinds of ways. So can the shul bear that? I mean, it's a question. I'm not sure that the answer is always yes, but I think it's going to be sometimes yes. And my point is, it shouldn't be always no. Meaning, I think that we should find ways, but there is going to be a price for us to pay as a community when we find those ways to incorporate people, within our communities, so that they continue to live routine lives that lengthen their periods of lucidity, that slow the deterioration. But that means that we as a community need to step up and say, we're willing to bear that. We're willing to accept that price, that our davening will be a little bit less orderly, if you will, right? Are you willing to have someone with, ADHD, right, who's hyperactive and can't stay put, in shul for 2 hours while we daven Shachris and Musaf and Kriyas Torah on Shabbos morning. Do you want that kid coming to shul? But he'll be walking around a lot, because he's hyperactive, or he'll have to bring one of those spinner things. You know what I'm talking about? Those spinners? We have them here in Israel. Did you have them? Like they used to spin them. I'm talking about. Anyway, the kids have them all the time. Anyway, so like one of those spinner things or fidget cubes. I don't even know what these things are, but there's something called a fidget cube. People with also or hyperactive users, sometimes they take these cubes and they fiddle with them, right? So, do you want these things in shul, or do you want shul to be like, like very, very proper, like you remember it, everyone's standing still, and just like focusing and et cetera, et cetera. Don't get me wrong, everyone loves being in shul when it's like that, maybe, and like it's more like pure and kind of like sanitized experience, and sure, I mean, I'm not against that in any way, shape, or form. My point is that we have to kind of make a decision on some level, if we want these kids in shul or not. I personally think we should have the kids in shul. I think we should make space for them. They don't have to sit in the center of shul and do it in front of everybody. They could sit maybe on the sides. Maybe, we can designate a space or whatever it is. Whatever, it doesn't matter. You to figure out according to your shul, et cetera, et cetera. But like I said, there's a price to pay as a community, for some of these things. But these are the kinds of questions that I get. All right, and my point is that we either deal with it or we don't deal with it. If we don't deal with it, here's my point: we probably will never know that we didn't. Meaning, those people won't complain, they won't come, they won't discuss, they won't write articles in the paper about how they're unwell and no one treated them nicely. Maybe later on in life, like sometimes things come out later on. But in real time, you'll never know it. In real time, you'll never know it, because you'll continue davening in your way, and you'll continue doing your thing in your community, and you'll never know that they were there, or that they felt bad, or whatever happened. But that's a price also to pay. So I think that we need to air this discussion out, and that's what I came to do, and that's why also I'm speaking here today. So I hope that clarifies a few of the issues and explains some of them, and I'm happy to take comments or questions. So please go ahead.
Thank you so much for that presentation. Maybe we'll have people put questions in the chat,
Sure.
and I'll read them. Is that a good format to keep the?
Yep.
So I'll read the first. This is from Michael Felder. Do you feel it's always crucial for you to speak with? And first of all, thank you. Just having this discussion. I'll say this at the outset. Just having this discussion is very important. I know the examples highlight why. So thank you, and your family. For that. Do you feel it's always crucial for you to speak with the person's personal therapist and/or psychiatrist?
That's a good question. I think that it's crucial to get information. So if you cannot get the information from the patient themselves, the person themselves, then yes, you would need to speak to the therapist. Sometimes even if you get information from the person themselves, you'll need to speak to the therapist and figure out like what's going on from their perspective. So I wouldn't say it's always important, but it's certainly not you certainly can't paskin on paper. That's my feeling. It's almost always you cannot paskin just from someone's very short message to you. I don't think I've ever answered a mental health question without some follow-up to the original question, which I have done with other kinds of Shabbos, right? If someone asks me a Shabbos question, I can usually just answer it. I don't need to ask some follow-ups. I don't think I've ever answered a mental health question without some degree of follow-up, either with the person themselves or with the therapist involved. Yes, for sure. And the book, by the way, encourages that too. Sorry.
Yitz, is that you raising your hand?
Yeah, I can't type my question in because I'm on my phone. First of all, thank you so much. We've got a couple of psychiatrists and a clinical social worker sitting in this kitchen, so many of the terms and all the mental health discussion is not new to us. But one thing that I noticed was that many of the examples you gave were reacting to active illness. And very often what we're trying to do is maintain wellness. So I guess my question is, are there instances where someone has recovered from depression, but part of their maintenance might include using those same coping mechanisms, which may be music on Shabbat? And how do you answer those types of questions?
It's a good question. And you're right, because rabbis are better at answering halachic questions that are live rather than halachic questions that, might come up in the future, in some way, right? And that's absolutely true. I'll give you one example of a less reactive to a live situation sort of thing, and then I'll try to answer your specific question. Okay, so when I dealt with anorexia and Yom Kippur, that was a question that I had, meaning my understanding, and I spoke to 6 different doctors about this to make sure that I understood what everybody thought, to make sure that I was also reproducible, meaning that all the doctors agreed. So I wanted to make sure of that. What I understood was, when I spoke about anorexia with them, was that there were, in a sense, 3 sort of situations. Situation number 1, when the person was in physical danger, meaning they were so underweight that they were in physical danger. Obviously, then they would not be able to fast on Yom Kippur. The second situation was also a no-brainer. The person is out of physical danger, but they're still very much in the danger zone up here, meaning the anorexia is still very much active, and they're still very much battling it and trying to get balanced in terms of their diet and what they're eating, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, that person doesn't fast, on Yom Kippur. There's no doubt about it. But what about a person who's already passed? What about a person who's been balanced for a year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? What about a person who, last time they suffered a real lapse in terms of anorexia was just years and years and years ago? Now, even over there, I would be very careful. From speaking to doctors, my feeling was be very, very careful with anorexia, no matter how long ago it was, because it's similar, not exactly like an addiction, but it's similar to an addiction in the sense that once you do it once, it's like if they fast once, it's like a high a little bit, So therefore, they could relish that sense of control again, and then they could relapse to doing it again and again and again, and that could be very, very dangerous. So there's definitely there, right? I didn't say that they definitely should never, ever, ever, ever fast, and have other reasons for that too. But definitely there, it was about maintaining the situation. Meaning I realized that maintenance was important, and therefore, even after many years, I would counsel to be very careful about fasting even years after. Now, with anorexia, as the people in your living room, I guess, well know, the mortality rate is quite high. So the lower estimates talk about 10% of people. The higher estimates talk about 30%. That's unbelievable. 30% of people who are in treatment, not about the ones who are not treated, even with treatment and everything, 30%, according to the higher estimates, who take their own lives or die some other way from malnutrition or whatever. So it's very, very sad. And because of those statistics, it was clear to me that the entire thing is very close to pikuach nefesh. It would be a little bit different with the case you're suggesting, which is, of course, depression. But nevertheless, and once again, it's a little bit sanitized, the case, because it's just depression. Although we all know that a lot of times a lot of other things too. So therefore, but if it was just depression, let's say, right? So I would say it depends on the severity of how severe the depression was, and here I would talk to a therapist and ask, if I don't allow this, how likely is it that it would affect the person negatively? And if the therapist said to me, he definitely, if he doesn't, have this coping mechanism throughout, has to be also Shabbos, the chances of deterioration are significant, then I would allow it also. To put it, to sum up, yes, I agree that also prevention falls into the leniency, into the category of leniency. Okay. I hope that answers the question.
I will say I get versions of that question a fair amount, and I've had no idea how to deal with it. So thank you. I probably should have talked to you before this thing, but okay. Adam or Elisheva, one of you, it says Elisheva, I see a hand raised, but it's Adam, I had a feeling. Okay, yes.
Yes. Sorry, I couldn't type. I have a little baby here. And I apologize for any dogs barking in the background. So first of all, again, thank you for covering this. I think it's really important. I'm a trauma therapist. I work mostly with victims and survivors of interpersonal trauma. And some of the things you talked about, so like dissociative identity disorder, often are correlated with extreme trauma in childhood. So I guess my question is, we're talking about sort of what to do in the aftermath with someone who survived those things. I wonder, and maybe this is beyond the scope of your book, but what does Halacha say about sort of dealing with someone who perpetrates these things? So, for example, I deal with children who are sexually abused. About 15% of those cases are ever even reported to police, and a much lower percentage are ever adjudicated in any way. So, within our communities, how do we deal with people who've caused harm? Obviously we have to provide care for the people who've experienced the harm, but what does Halacha, what do the rabbis say about dealing with the people who've caused the harm, particularly if there's going to be any sort of...
I do get halachic questions about that in the context of kibbud avayim. So the survivors of those traumas many times do ask me whether they have to respect their parents, whether they have any such obligation, whether they have to interact with their parents. And many times those same parents who abuse their children, whether it's emotionally, sexually, or physically, at a young age, continue to abuse them by, it's like unbelievable to me, but they continue to abuse them by throwing kibbud avayim in their face. So they say to them, you have to respect me, you have to interact with me, you can't just ignore me, etc., etc., etc. And it's like unbelievable that after it's such chutzpah that they would do such a thing. But nevertheless, absolutely, I do get questions like that. So I'm not sure that that's exactly your question, but I'll just say one half of your question, right? I do sometimes get asked about how to treat those individuals by the children. I think that you were not asking exactly that. You were asking more about how the community should deal with those individuals. That's a little bit of a different kind of question and less halachic, and also depends a little bit on the case and on the community. So it's a little bit more complicated because the question is kind of like, what does the community gain or lose by dealing with the situation? So sometimes it does gain or lose. In other words, let's say if the child davens in that shul and sees the father or the mother, be respected and get covered, one kind or another, throughout, so that might be harmful to the child, and then the question is, to what extent does the community need to be judge, jury, and executioner, in a situation which never went to court, never went to the police, etc., but the person claims. So there's a lot of stuff that goes into this, right? And it's really kind of hard for me to obviously draw a line in the sand and say, this is what you should do. But obviously, we need to be sensitive. And if the situation is very clear cut, right, and the hurt was very significant, then obviously I would say that we should stand by the side of the victim. But I also don't want to make that a general comment, to be applied in all cases, because it really would depend on the situation. So it's easier to simply advise the specific individual, like I said, about what to do in terms of the parent, rather than to advise the community. There, I would really say the rabbis and the community leaders should think well and hard, before they do something that is revolutionary, shall we say. Maybe I didn't answer your question at all, but I tried.
No, I think you're right about the individual level. I think one other piece that I'll add, and you don't need to respond so that other people can add their thoughts, but is that I think particularly in an Orthodox context, these issues often are gendered. It's a man causing a harm to women and children, and then men often have more sort of capital within the community to sort of continue to operate, where the women end up in these sort of stigmatized situations or isolating themselves. So just kind of adding that element there.
Yeah, that's very sad, but quite true.
gotten two questions to my private chat, so I'll read them. I assume that people don't want their names, which is why they privately messaged. Neither said that, but maybe I shouldn't even said that. And then the questions are, one is, so as someone knows of someone that suffered from depression and for whatever reason, I don't know if they're given permission or not, but decided they were going to go to the beach to deal with this. And they're going to the beach on Shabbat. They really wanted to deal with it and they thought the beach would be calm. I presume it means driving to the beach because the beach isn't walking distance from here. And the question is, I was really nervous. They felt fine about doing it, apparently, but they were very nervous about being seen in their car and also waited till the rest of their family went to shul and felt like they had to sneak about it. And they're wondering, in general, should these things be kind of quiet and sneaky, or should the community, I'll maybe add weight to their question if I could, right? If someone needed a medical procedure on Shabbat, we wouldn't, I don't think anyone would feel, any compunction about calling the ambulance. We've called an ambulance at shul when someone had a heart attack and they just went to the hospital. We didn't pretend there wasn't an ambulance or anything. So I guess the question is, should it be done kind of quietly, or should it be okay to tell children, I suppose, hey, I'm sick and I'm going to the beach?
Right. That's a very good question. It's a very good question. I'll give us. I was never asked that specific question, but I will give you a similar question, and we can infer from there. Okay. For example, there was someone with borderline personality disorder who felt that it was very therapeutic for her to play the piano, and that playing instrument would be helpful. Now, it's very interesting on a halachic level. Playing an instrument would probably be easier than, let's say, listening to music with your earphones on YouTube. Yeah, that probably is on a halachic level more fraught. And playing the piano is no big deal. But on a farhesia level, meaning in terms of what it does to the community, right? You're walking by someone's house and you hear them playing the piano, right? On Shabbos Kodesh, right? If it's your neighbor, and you're eating, and the frum guy who's living next to you, he's going away on his guitar. It's what does that do to your Shabbos, right? So once again, that goes back to my discussion about what kind of a Shabbos do we want, right? Now, I'm sensitive to that question because it really is a question. In other words, I don't want to ruin everyone's Shabbos, right? I don't want to give up, the kind of feeling and environment that we've created around Shabbat. I think that's a great thing. On the other hand, I don't want those people to hide what they're doing necessarily. Should we tell that person they shouldn't play the piano because it ruins our Shabbos, or should we tell them they could because it helps them deal with their BPD? So which one is it, right? In the same way, the question you're asking, in a sense, right? Assuming that driving to the beach is fine, right? Should the person do it at the dead of night when no one's seeing, or should they get in their car while everyone's walking to shul, and drive away? Yeah, which one is the better one? I would, in an ideal world, I would love it if the person would feel comfortable, everybody knowing that they drive to the beach, but that they would choose to do it at a time that wasn't bothering everybody. Yeah, just because they wanted to conserve for them, but not because they felt ashamed and they felt embarrassed, etc. That they really needed that, and if they need that, then they need to do it, and then that's fine. In other words, that we're all open and honest in a sense, but that openness and honesty also is accompanied by a sensitivity to everyone's needs. So the community has a need to conserve its Shabbos, and that person has a need to drive. And I think that's okay. We have to find the middle, in a sense, between those things. That's my feeling.
Great. And so the final question, I think, is really, I'll turn it into a comment. I don't even know if you need to respond, and we'll close on this note. And I'm really grateful for you joining us. And the final question was, do you feel that, you mentioned you went to rabbis to discuss these matters, and do you feel that you're asking these rabbis, rather than kind of distilling wisdom that existed, may have influenced how they thought about these issues? I'm quite sure, I'm going to turn this into a compliment. I'm quite sure the answer is yes. You're going around to leading rabbis, asking, educating, and discussing with them issues of mental health is certainly moving the needle in a way that helps people live better lives, and that is a mitzvah. So thank you for joining us. Thank you for everyone for joining us this morning, the thoughtful questions and opening up this discussion. I know I learned a lot, and from the talk and the questions. And Rav Yoni, we are excited about your book we'll be promoting it. I hope it'll be on every bookshelf, and we're really grateful for what you're doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, thank you, everyone. Rav Yoni, stay safe over there, and to other friends in Israel, a few Israelis on the call, you all, we're thinking of you, and everyone have a good day or night, as it may be.
And I'll just quickly say that if anybody needs my contact details, you can get them from me, Barry.
Yes.
So.
Thank you so much.